Welcome to this lecture today on normative ethics, in particular focusing on two of the main theories in normative ethics as an attempt to discuss the foundation of normative ethics for thinking about bioethical issues across the board. So what exactly is right and wrong? Last time we talked about Aristotle and Aristotle's kind of notion of the good life and understanding goodness and badness in relation to the function or purpose of a thing. But that doesn't give us a good picture of what it is for an action to be right or what it is for an action to be wrong. And it seems like insofar as there are these properties of actions, there might be something like an underlying feature or property that explains or helps explain why particular actions are right and why other actions are wrong. And trying to understand these things is important for doing ethics, trying to give these kinds of explanations. There are further questions sort of at the foundational level, and many of these questions are what are often called meta-ethical questions, questions about the basis of ethics itself. And these questions come to, questions about how we could possibly know whether or not anything is right or anything is wrong. I mean, we certainly seem to know that certain actions like murder or genocide are wrong, while other actions like doing a good job taking care of your children or something is morally right. But how do we know these things? How do we come to know these things? It's not as if we can see them. It's not as if morality is somehow like a color or a property of an object in a certain way where we can just kind of perceive it. So how is it possible to know if someone or something is moral or immoral if it's not possible to perceive them? Or perceive the property. And similarly, like there's this question of whether or not morality is the same for everyone, right? Or if some form of relativism is true. The idea that what's true for you is true for you, but what's true for me might be different than what's true for you. Or just the idea that different cultures have different opinions about what's right and what's wrong and treat different actions differently. And whether or not that's okay, or whether or not that makes it the case that morality is kind of in the eye of the beholder or relative to different ways of thinking. I want to start by just removing this attraction of relativism rather shortly and quickly. I mean, relativism itself, I think, is a rather interesting and deep philosophical possibility when it comes to morality, but at least a surface form of relativism is rather unattractive, even though many people seem to promote it. The surface form of relativism is simply based on the idea often that people have different opinions about morality. It's, different people think that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. There's like a classic, I believe it's like some two Greek factions in ancient Greece, ones living on different islands. One group thought that it was morally wrong to burn your dead. And instead, they thought it was morally right to eat the dead. In fact, they thought that it was morally right to that you basically like honored the dead and you kind of took on their power by eating them. Well, while the other group across the way on the other island literally had the reverse opinion. Right? They thought it was morally wrong to eat the dead, but morally right to burn the dead in order to send them on. Who's right? The fact that these people have different opinions, the idea would be, oh, well, neither of them, or both of them, they're right relative to their own culture, and so it doesn't, so there is no like absolute here. Well, just because people have different opinions doesn't really mean that difference of opinion sort of is undergirded by no fact of the matter. Differences of opinion, there are different kinds of fields or subject matters where there are differences of opinion, but oftentimes when it comes to the fact that there are differences of opinion, that's because there are legitimate ways of thinking in different ways, even though one person could be wrong. Right. I mean, think about the fact that people have had different opinions about the shape of the planet Earth. They still do, right? There are still some flat earthers out there. That doesn't mean that there's no fact of the matter, or that somehow the truth of whether or not the Earth is spherical or not is just is relative, right? Um, and the fact that, difference of opinions exist doesn't mean that no one is right or wrong, right? Somebody is wrong in this kind of case. And so the same thing probably and can plausibly go for morality. I mean, like, think about, like, it's murder is wrong. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's not just because somebody thinks that, right? If somebody differs in opinion, that doesn't seem that plausible. And it's just because it's really difficult in a sense to understand how it is that we could come to know whether or not something is true or false when it comes to moral objectivity, or just because it's difficult to have that kind of moral knowledge with any sort of certainty, that doesn't necessarily either mean that morality is in some sense relative. Just because there's no final arbiter of what is true in morality when it comes to our being able to know. No authority figure that we can sort of turn to, or scientific tests that we can sort of run, does not mean in any way that morality is not objectively true or false, that some particular theory isn't correct or incorrect, and that some particular platitude or action type isn't right or wrong, right? There could be a fact of the matter. And there are sort of examples here, I think, that are sort of obvious, right? So the simplest one is, imagine two of you take the same exam, and in fact, one of you cheats off the other one. So ultimately, you end up turning in literally the same exam, but I don't know which of you has cheated. And I look at one exam and I assign it an A because it's pretty good, and I look at the other exam and I assign it a D. And I don't, I don't even like, and you're both, I mean, confident because literally you turned in the exact same exam. So whatever grade goes for one seems like it should go for the other. But why am I able to grade one an A and one with a D? Like, you should, in a sense, could come to me and be like, what gives? And then I say something like, well, that person's that person and you're you. Things are relative, right? I just, I felt like it. It doesn't like, this seems to be somehow there's something wrong here, right? There's something objectively wrong here. I'm not being consistent. I'm not being consistent in how I'm treating these two papers in these two people, these two students. Inconsistency here, like, the inconsistency seems to be real, right? And it seems wrong. It's there's a real wrongness to this kind of inconsistency when it comes to treating individuals. And a final, like, that because of that, if I grade relativistically like that, and you find yourself kind of crying out like, no, that's problematic. You're doing something irrational. You're doing something wrong. That's, then you're on board. You think that morality really is, in some sense, objective at bottom. And the final last-ditch effort to sort of make you all, reject relativism is the idea that somehow what the Nazis did isn't wrong. Just because, there's a sense in which, from their point of view, what they were doing was okay, right? That doesn't mean jack squat in this case, right? Just because they thought what they were doing was okay in any context does not make it okay. And, it's hugely problematic to try and commit genocide of an entire race. All right, sort of a nod towards relativism, though, is available, and that's when we think of in terms of what we might call value pluralism. It might be the case that there are many different kinds of things that are valuable, but that doesn't mean that there is no right or wrong, right? It's possible that people have values and that people order their values differently. So, and it might not be the case ultimately that there's a correct hierarchy of values. It may be that, you can think of this in terms of like Eastern and Western civilizations, right? Eastern civilizations tend to value the whole, the group more than the individual. Whereas like Western civilizations like ours tend to value individual rights, individual freedoms more than the good of the whole group. Whether or not one way of thinking is better than another, I don't think, that's to be argued. Whether or not there's actually a right or wrong answer as to which value ought to be at the top or sort of taken more seriously than the other, I'm not really sure. But that doesn't mean that, relativism reigns. That doesn't mean that there is no right or wrong answer when it comes to particular questions of morality. We can, I think, at the very least, take seriously the thought that certain things really do objectively have value. If there were things that just, if there were no real values in the world, things were not valuable to individuals or something of the sort, then yeah, maybe relativism would end up being a better way of thinking about things. But it does seem that there really are things that objectively have some kind of value, that is value apart from the fact that we want them. And those kinds of things are, at least from different perspectives, taken up and taken seriously. And one, particular ethical view that has an answer to the idea of what ultimately is valuable is the utilitarian view. The utilitarian view says that ultimately the thing that is of most value in human life, sort of in the world, is happiness, or as they think of it often, a kind of pleasure. So let's think a little bit more closely about utilitarianism. So utilitarianism has three main components. First is hedonism. Hedonism is the theory that involves the notion of pleasure here. Hedonism says that the most valuable thing worthy of pursuit is pleasure. The sort of hedonism takes the motivating factor behind all of our actions to be an attempt to escape displeasure and achieve pleasure. Now, hedonism is an interesting, there's different forms of hedonism. You might be thinking of like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but and that's, there's a certain kind of hedonistic component to that. But you might also think a little bit differently and take the idea of pleasure to be more broad. You might take the idea of pleasure to involve certain levels of flourishing, or a certain kind of more Aristotelian spin. But it is interesting to ask the question whether or not hedonism is true, especially whether or not that word most valuable is actually correct. There are some interesting puzzles here, right? Is it really the case that pleasure somehow is the most valuable thing? Are there not other things that are of equal value or more value, like knowledge or family, anything like love? I don't know. Some of these other things seem like they could be of at least comparable value to pleasure. But the hedonist wants to say, no, look, the entire game of morality is played around this concept of pleasure. We seek pleasure, we pursue pleasure, and pleasure is sort of central. So central to the utilitarian view is this idea that we ought to be pleasure-seeking at all costs. Consequentialism is the second aspect of utilitarianism. So consequentialism is the idea that the only thing that matters when it comes to morality are the consequences of an action. So actions, you take an action and the action has a particular consequence. And then the idea is that we determine whether or not an action is a good action or a bad action, a right action or a wrong action, depending on whether or not the consequences of that action are good or bad. Right. So an action is right if the consequences are good, an action is wrong if the consequences are bad. And so you need to look to the consequences in order to determine that. Now, taking consequentialism and applying it and adding it to hedonism, we have now the idea that actions are good insofar as the consequences produce pleasure, and bad insofar as the consequences fail to produce pleasure or produce displeasure. And then finally, the final aspect of utilitarianism is this kind of maximalist understanding of, look, it's always the case that more value is better than less value. When it comes to creating certain kinds of value in the world, you should always try to create more than less. And I mean, there's an interesting question though of like, well, more value for who, more value where, but that doesn't really matter. This is just a general idea here. And now we take the sort of three of these things and combine them, right? So if you take hedonism, so pleasure is the thing that's worth pursuing. The consequences, consequentialism, the consequences are the only things that matter morally speaking. And maximalism, you ought to be trying to sort of maximize these good consequences. Well, what do you end up with? The utilitarianism. And what is utilitarianism? Well, utilitarianism says that what we should do is maximize the expected utility of our actions, which is ultimately to try and create the most amount of pleasure for the most amount of people possible. We need to sort of act in certain ways such that pleasure, so no individual person's pleasure is put above the rest. But yeah, and so what we need to do is, you might even need to act in a way that sacrifices your own pleasure if you can, by doing so, maximize pleasure for everyone else, right? So that's the utilitarian thought. It's kind of, a good idea in the sense that what it is to act morally or to do a good thing is to try and act in such a way that everyone is better off because of your action. And everyone is better off in the sense that they are able to, experience more good stuff, more pleasure in some way, shape, or form, whether that involves, eating better food or experiencing, higher quality of life, a higher standard of life. These utilitarian ideas are, I think, rather helpful, right? Like, invent something, go out and invent something that all of a sudden changes a lot of the ways that people live their lives. That's like the utilitarian maxim, right? Just do it in such a way that everyone's going to benefit. So utilitarianism, via the sort of utilitarian principle, gives us what we might think of as a moral decision procedure. And remember back to the Aristotelian, the discussion of Aristotelian virtue ethics, Aristotle doesn't really give us a great guide to what it is that we should do in order to act morally. All he can really say is like, hey, look, here's the good life. Here are the people that live the good life. They're the ones that are virtuous. And so in order to do the right thing, what you should be doing is acting in accordance with the way that the virtuous person would act. Trying to be a virtuous person, that doesn't tell you what you should do in any given situation, because you kind of already have to know what the virtuous person would do. And that's hard in a sense. Whereas the utilitarian theory, maximize expected utility, gives us a perfectly obvious decision procedure. Do whatever it is that will bring about the most pleasure and remove the most displeasure from the most people, or just sentient life forms, the kinds of creatures that can actually feel pain or pleasure. And you should be trying to maximize pleasure for all of them, for including the animals in a sense, right? The idea for hedonism being that pleasure is what matters. So really, animals are going to matter too, because they can feel pleasure, and so we should be maximizing pleasure for all of them. And when it comes to trying to decide what to do, well, obviously, doing the right thing is just figure out which action is going to make the most people the most happy, give the most people the most pleasure, give the most pleasure-seeking creatures the most pleasure, and do that thing. Great. So now we know, at least on the utilitarian theory, how to act rightly. We just do whatever brings about the most pleasure. Now, so morality for utilitarianism basically is what I was just saying. Actions are right insofar as they produce the maximum amount of happiness possible, and actions are wrong insofar as they fail to produce the maximum amount of happiness possible. In a sense, this seems on the surface great, right? Like if you have multiple things before you, actions that you can take, and one of them is going to make everyone better off, then you should take that action. That seems like the right thing to do. Whereas to take the other action where, maybe you make yourself better off, but everyone else worse off, seems like the wrong thing to do, right? You should try and make more people more happy than, just making yourself happy. That seems to be a very obvious moral platitude. There's results though of thinking about morality this way. One of which is that it turns out that it's really hard to be moral, right? It's really hard to be moral because you've got to be always doing the thing that is the maximum, that brings about the maximum amount of happiness that's possible. I mean, and maybe there's multiple options available to you that all bring about the same amount of happiness. That's fine. Then you can, morally speaking, take any of those actions. But as long as you don't take any action that brings about less than the maximum amount of happiness. But that seems a little bit weird too, right? Like, what if you can bring about something, you can do something that brings about slightly less happiness? Well, according to utilitarian morality, that's wrong. It's like morally wrong to do that thing, given that there was something that you could do that would have brought about more possible happiness. And in a sense, this is kind of, there's some plausibility to this insofar as we do think that we aren't as moral as we could be and should be, right? We often are not doing enough to be as good as we could be, and we need to do better, right? This is a sort of moral progress is real, and morality is hard, and we need to try and make progress in being moral. And that means something like we need to change our laws, change our actions, try and create new products and invent things and build new social structures that help people more, make people better off. And that's how we can be more moral as individuals and as a society. This is great too when applied to a bioethical framework, right? So the thought is just that you should be maximizing the best possible outcomes for the most people, right? Trying to avoid them from their pain, from death, from things that they dislike that bring them displeasure, trying to make them as good, well off as possible, make as many people as well off as possible. And we have lots of different interesting examples here, right? So like wartime emergency medicine is a good one. When you come across a set of injured soldiers and you see that some of them are just simply not going to make it, you give them morphine and move on to ones that are going to make it. You're trying to save the maximum number of people and not allow anyone that is at least savable to die or to fall into ill health. Well, people that in a normal context you would be trying to save, even though it was sort of a fat chance that they would live, because what you do is you opiate them, right? You give them something to cure the pain and allow them to die. But the idea here is that you've acted in such a way that you've brought about the most amount of or the least amount of displeasure to the most amount of people, right? You've tried to do the best thing that you can to help the most. Similarly, like public health sanctions and regulations, right? So the recent mask guidance for COVID-19 is an attempt to get everyone to do as much as they can to cause the least amount of harm to everyone else. Similarly with the vaccine. Things like the FDA, right? Or, the different organizations that regulate certain kinds of things that are like that we ingest, right? Whether or not something is good for you in a sense, or just good enough for you to not harm you when you take it. Drugs needing to go through trials. These kinds of things are attempts at legislating certain processes so that the least harm comes to the most amount of people on the whole. So what about the good here of this theory, and what's good about this theory and what's bad about this theory? Well, if it works, it does a great job at helping everyone live well, right? Like creating the most pleasure for the most people. If this theory is true, in a sense, it's it seems sort of spot on certain general cases. Like, yeah, if we're all trying to make more people more happy, we're all going to end up being happy. But the theory is problematic, at least in a few different ways. There are reasons for thinking that utilitarianism is false in some senses, because the theory itself can justify what we might think of as extreme paternalism, and might even violate the rights of particular individuals. And we'll talk about this momentarily. So there's a number of problems for utilitarianism. Now kind of turning to discussion of criticisms of the view. And you might have sort of already foreseen some of these in the way that I presented the theory. One is that this theory is too demanding. It's really, really hard to know what's right and what's wrong to do, because it's really, really hard to know what's going to create the most happiness, right? I mean, like, think about it. You right now are sitting here listening to a lecture. Is there not like some possible situation in which you could not be listening to this lecture right now and somehow be making more people more happy? I mean, probably. You could at the very least not be, you could be making yourself more happy by playing some video games or eating some ice cream or something like that. That would at least make more people more happy than sitting here listening to a lecture, right? But that seems insane in a certain sense, right? Like that you're doing something that's morally wrong right now because you're not making the most people the most happy while you're sitting around listening to a lecture. That would be a bad thing if a moral theory said, oh yeah, this very normal, very basic thing that everybody, that people do, well, that's actually morally wrong most of the time. Right? That seems problematic. But that does kind of call out to something that's a little bit too extreme. Like that does seem like most utilitarian theorists do think, well, we need to take into account the fact that people don't usually know what exactly is going to make the most people the most happy. But we still ought to be acting in certain ways where we do know, right, what is going to create the most happiness. And that's where the morality really lies. It matters in known happiness production rather than, actual happiness production. Another problem for the view is whether or not the question, hedonism. Hedonism is just really problematic because of the idea that it says that pleasure is really the only or most valuable thing. And there's a classic counterexample to this that goes by way of a thought experiment. The thought experiment is this. Imagine there was this machine, the experience machine, and you could get into it. And if you got into it, it would kind of, it would sort of, you'd forget that you're in it. You'd still be living your life, but all of the things that you did in your life would bring about an extreme amount of pleasure. And the machine would kind of play along with you. It's almost as if you're like stepping into the matrix, but the machine is kind of there to give you as much as you can get out of it, right? So you get into the machine, you forget that you're in the machine, your life keeps going, but all these great things start to happen, right? You meet the love of your life and fall head over heels, and they fall head over heels for you. You end up having the greatest job you could ever possibly imagine wanting. You end up with the greatest children you could imagine having. You rise to the top of whatever power scheme you want to have power in. You become the best athlete at whatever, these kinds of things. All of this pleasure comes into your life because you're in this machine. Now the question, so that's what would happen if you were in the machine, and you'd live the rest of your life in the machine, and but you'd be in extreme pleasure. And then the way that Nozick, who invented this thought experiment, asks is like, well, would you get into the machine? And most people's response is, well, no, I don't want to get into the machine. Like, and knows, yeah, but then the thought is, well, if you think hedonism's true, if you think pleasure is all that really matters, then you ought to be like chomping at the bit to get into this machine, right? Because it's going to give you the maximum amount of pleasure you could possibly ever have. And the problem here, I think, for most people often seems to be something like, well, yeah, but what about my family? What about the people around me? Like, I want to be able to see them and stuff. And then the thought is, well, you will, just the fake versions of them, and you won't know that they're fake in the simulation. But that seems part of the problem, right? And part of the problem then seems to be that, well, somehow these experiences that you're going to have are inauthentic, They're fake in some sense, even though they are bringing about an extreme amount of pleasure. And that is a detracting factor that seems to bring about a certain amount of disvalue to this whole situation. So even though you could be experiencing a whole lot of pleasure, if the pleasure in some sense isn't authentic, isn't experienced while in the presence of your actual friends and family, then it doesn't seem as desirable. And that's the general thought, is that something beyond merely pleasure, right? Like this sense of authenticity, of reality, is somehow just as valuable or more valuable than the pleasure itself. And so hedonism seems problematic, if not false, simply on this basis. Another problem for utilitarianism is the tyranny of the majority, in the sense that, it's always the case that the larger group, the happiness of the larger group is going to win out. Imagine there's some minority group that the destruction of which would bring about the majority group a great amount of pleasure, and there wouldn't be very much pleasure lost in a genocide in this case, right? Well, that seems rather problematic, right? That seems like there's no justice in that way of thinking, but it seems like utilitarianism is going to justify it on the basis of the attempt to maximize happiness. The two sort of major problems, though, for utilitarianism, I think, are these. One is a problem for consequentialism. And the problem for consequentialism is the idea that really the consequences aren't the only things that matter when it comes to morality. When it comes to making moral decisions, when it comes to thinking about what it is that you ought to do sort of in your life with the rest of your life, an attempt to make the most people the most happy is, a valid thing to be thinking about, but it's not really how, we normally think of you being such that you ought to govern your entire life that way, right? Everyone kind of, recognizes that there are certain things that you can do in your life that would be self-sacrificing in such a way that you could bring about more pleasure to more people. But there's not really an expectation that people do that. We don't think of individuals as immoral in some sense for deciding to become an artist rather than become a doctor, right? Even if they have the ability to do either. And so, it seems like when it comes to making these large format moral decisions, the consequences that like making the best consequences happen just don't seem always to come into play. Maximizing happiness doesn't seem always to be the only thing that matters. Sometimes a person's integrity matters, a person's life plans, personal life plans, goals, thoughts, hopes, dreams, those things seem to matter. And so it's not just the case that the consequences of actions matter. And then finally, sort of the largest problem for utilitarianism is the problem of justice. Justice itself seems unserved by utilitarianism because on the utilitarian view, it seems that the ends can always be justified, or the means can always be justified by the ends that are ultimately gained, right? So whatever maximizes happiness, you can do that, right? So if murder maximizes happiness, genocide maximizes happiness, so violating individuals' rights, if it maximizes happiness, then you should do it. So like there's lots of, classic examples here that get a little bit out of hand, but one is, imagine you've got one slightly sick person in the hospital and 5 very ill people that need organ transplants. It just so happens that the slightly ill person is a perfect match for these 5 other people. Well, in a sense, what should you do as a doctor? Well, according to the utilitarian view, you should maybe kill or allow to die this one slightly ill person in order to harvest their organs and distribute them amongst the other 5, thereby, saving 5 lives, creating 5 times as much happiness as allowing the one, as the one person versus the 5. Clearly 5 times happiness is more and better. But that seems really problematic, right? You don't want to, it seems to be violating the rights of the individual to either, kill them or allow them to die in such a way when they could have been saved while the other 5 people, are going to die anyway. The problem of justice becomes rather stark, I think, in these cases. It just, there are certain kinds of things where it seems like violating someone's rights, violating someone's life, just shouldn't be done or can't be done morally, no matter how much happiness it brings into the world, no matter how much pleasure it brings into the world. One way of thinking about this, and sort of an interesting and helpful way of attempting to start to transition away from the utilitarian way of thinking and onto a more deontological approach, is through the trolley problem. Hopefully you may have seen this drawing and the memes that it is that have followed from it. If you're watching this right now, you feel free to pause and watch the other trolley problem YouTube video that I've posted on GouchoSpace. Now, the way that the trolley problem classically goes is that, suppose, there's a runaway trolley and you find yourself standing next to a lever. You see that the trolley is going down the track at a high speed. It's not going to stop. And on the track that it's on, it's going to hit 5 unwitting, workers or people for some reason. And you realize that you're standing next to this lever, that if you pull the lever, it'll divert the trolley, thereby saving the 5 people that, were going to get killed. However, there is one unwitting person on the other track. And so your pulling the lever ultimately dooms the person on the one person on the track who wouldn't have died, otherwise, if you'd done nothing, but saves the 5, right? So the thought here is, you've saved 5 but you've killed 1 if you pull the lever, and if you don't pull the lever, then the one person, continues to live while 5 people die. And then the question here is supposed to be, well, what should you do? Should you pull the lever? Is it morally permissible to pull the lever? What's the thing to do here? Should you allow these 5 people to die? Should you actively get involved and save these 5 people, but, through your actions, actually, in some sense, be responsible for killing 1 person? What should you do? Well, the utilitarian idea, or thought process here is obvious. You should pull the lever, thereby killing 1 person, but saving 5 people. And that tends to be how a lot of people think. People tend to agree that in this case, where you're standing near the trolley lever, you should pull the lever. You should pull the lever, diverting the trolley, killing 1 and saving 5. However, there's another version of the case, and this version is a little bit trickier, right? So on this version, there's no lever, but there is a footbridge over the trolley. And the runaway trolley is going to, in the same situation, hit the 5. But it turns out, you're standing next to a large enough person that you realize that if you push the large enough person off the footbridge and onto the trolley tracks, then they'll take the brunt of the force of the trolley, thereby slowing it down enough that it won't hit the 5, right? In the same scenario here, you will sacrifice 1 person doing something that will kill them in order to save the 5 people below. So you can either, allow 5 to die, or, do something that kills 1 and saves, and thereby save the 5. In this case, though, people tend to think immediately like, no, this is not something that's morally okay, right? The utilitarian framework should be the same on this view, though, right? Like here, what's the difference between pulling a lever and thereby killing 1 and pushing someone, thereby killing them? Right? It just doesn't seem like that should matter. On the utilitarian framework, the consequences are the same in these cases, so you should both pull the lever and push the large man. But there's something that, at least intuitively, isn't right about this second case, right? Pushing the large man seems more wrong or more highly problematic than the pulling of the lever. And utilitarianism isn't giving us a good way of thinking about what could possibly be wrong here, right? And it's very unclear how we should think about morality in these two cases from a utilitarian standpoint, given that we are much more squeamish about the second one than about the first one. In fact, utilitarianism on the whole seems to suggest that we just shouldn't be squeamish about the second case. You should be just as gung-ho about pushing the large man as you were about pulling the lever, sacrificing one, thereby saving 5 people. So what exactly gives? What should we think about this here? Well, there's this classic thing that is called the doctrine of double effect that people appeal to in order to, like when thinking about this kind of case. And the doctrine of double effect is basically the idea that you can intend to do something with and foresee that certain consequences will come about, but as long as you don't intend necessarily those consequences, that then the action can be, seen to be morally acceptable. And so intuitively, the idea here is supposed to be something like, well, what changes the in the trolley case, that, well, in the first case, what makes it okay for you to pull the lever is that you foresee that by pulling the lever, one person will die, but you're trying to save the 5, right? You're trying to save the 5, and you don't intend for the one person to die. You just foresee that the person dies. You're intentionally saving 5 while foreseeing that one will die. However, in the case of the large man on the footbridge, it seems that it's impossible to not intend that the person die, right? It literally, you have to push the person, intentionally harming them, intentionally killing them, in order to save the other 5 lives. And in some sense, the thought here is, well, that would be wrong, because you're doing something intentionally. You're intentionally harming this person in order to save 5, and that's problematic. Whereas you're intentionally killing this person. Whereas merely foreseeing the bad consequences, that's a justified case. And there are better, more intuitive cases here that help draw out this same idea. One is the wartime bomber versus the terrorist bomber. Take these two cases, right? So in the one case, it's war, and you're trying to finish the war as quickly as possible with the least number of lives lost, and you're going to go bomb a ammunition factory, but it just so happens that the ammunition factory is right next to a children's sort of, like an elementary school. Now, if the ammunition, so in blowing up the ammunition factory, you run the risk of possibly damaging the elementary school, possibly thereby harming some of these elementary school children. Well, the thought here is it could, in a sense, be justified, right, in order to stop the war, to bomb this munitions factory with the unforeseen, with the foreseen consequence of some children dying, but unintended consequence, right? The wartime bomber, they're intending only to blow up the munitions factory, and they don't intend for any children to die, even if some end up dying. Whereas the terrorist bomber is, on the other hand, someone that wants to blow up the factory, and thereby, because they picked this factory because it's near a school, because they're intentionally trying to create as much terror as possible, right? It seems like even they have the same goal. They're trying to end the war as soon as possible, but they're trying to do it by means of terrifying their the opponent in the war. And so the terrorist bomber in this case foresees and intends the killing of the children, as well as the exploding of the munitions factory. And so the idea here is supposed to be, well, at the very least, it seems like in the one case, there's, the action is more justifiable, even if it's not really justifiable, It's more justifiable in the case of the wartime bomber than it is in the case of the terrorist bomber. The terrorist bomber is simply doing something atrocious on the way because of their intentions. Something similar you could think of maybe would be in the bioethics case is the idea of an intentional versus an unintentional death by some kind of morphine injection by a doctor. So imagine, you have a highly a cancer patient that's in an extreme amount of pain, and there are two different situations, right? One would be a doctor that gives the patient a morphine injection in order to take away the pain while foreseeing the possible consequence of the patient dying from the injection. That seems, possible and justifiable in certain cases. Whereas the other option would be someone, a doctor giving a patient a morphine injection, sort of intending to take away the pain and kill the patient, right? Because, they're at the end of life anyway. The idea here being the intentional killing is much more problematic. And so the fact of whether or not intentions matter to morality seems to come front and center here. So do intentions matter to morality? Do the intentions of an action matter like a lot to morality, more to morality than the consequences? That is, like, do you need to be sort of trying to be moral to avoid bad things or to avoid bad things from happening in order for your action to be truly good, right? This sort of plays in with another problem for utilitarianism, right? Imagine you are like, you hate your boss and you're actually like actively trying to kill your boss. And in so doing, you're trying to like sneak some arsenic, some poison into your boss's food. And accidentally, you mix up your arsenic with your aspirin, and you accidentally, so you're accidentally adding aspirin instead of arsenic to your boss's food. You're intentionally trying to kill your boss, but your boss is like, a little overweight and has a heart attack after eating the food. But because of the aspirin, you inadvertently save your boss's life, right? Well, and then this goes on to bring about a lot of people a lot more happiness, right? Well, it seems like on the utilitarian view, somehow you acted in the morally right way. You unintentionally did the thing that brought about the most happiness. But you were in fact intending to do something very different, intending to do something morally wrong, it would seem, even on the utilitarian view, right? If you killed this person. And on the utilitarian view, though, under the utilitarian calculus, your intention doesn't matter at all. Your intention doesn't matter at all because ultimately it does, like, whatever the means were to bring about the happiest, the most pleasurable situation, the better. And so you did a good thing instead of a bad thing. But it seems rather problematic to think that way, right? It seems like intentions do matter, and whatever you were doing, you were doing kind of the wrong thing in trying to kill your boss, even though you accidentally saved his life. So intentions do seem to matter. And so I think we can suppose that more than merely the consequences matter for morality. So consequentialism is problematic, and thereby utilitarianism is problematic. But what exactly is an intention, and how exactly do intentions matter, morally speaking? Like, what is it to try and think of an intention as somehow playing a role in morality? What exactly is going on? What are we doing when we are intending to do something but sort of haven't done it yet? Or intending to do one thing by doing another, right? And like, oftentimes you're trying to do one thing in order to achieve something else. So what exactly is it to do? And then what exactly is it to do something unintentionally, right? Like, what exactly does it mean to try to do something and accidentally do something else, or unintentionally do something else? Well, this brings us to thinking about Kant. Immanuel Kant was a famous German philosopher that lived, in 1724 to 1800. And he wrote many interesting and famous books, but two of which are still very influential today. One is The Critique of Pure Reason, where he lays out his epistemology and metaphysics. Very, very complex, very, very interesting, very, very strange theory called transcendental idealism. If you get a chance to take a class on Kant, I highly recommend it. Very fascinating guy. But for our purposes, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals is kind of the underlying theory to his entire moral framework for thinking about how we ought to act and live our lives. And this Kantian theory is often called deontology, or just Kantian ethics for short. Now, Kant thought that ultimately happiness, pleasure, even Aristotle's idea of flourishing can't really be the most valuable thing, the thing that matters most morally in the end. And the reason he thought that was because he sees happiness and pleasure as something that can be corrupted. Now, he accepts that they're valuable. He accepts that they're things that are worthy of pursuit. But he thinks that they can be corrupted, and he thinks that when they are corrupted, they become worse. And so what exactly does that mean here? Well, think about some good things like knowledge or courage or happiness or etc. And then think about people having these things that either don't deserve them or that they're sort of bad people. And Kant thinks okay, once you see that, you'll be like, oh, this is worse, right? So imagine a bad person that's extremely happy, right? You've got a person that's just objectively morally awful, but things go well for them, and so they are happy. Well, doesn't that seem wrong? Doesn't it seem like they deserve to be unhappy because they are so bad? Kant thinks in this case, the happiness of this person is in some sense corrupted. Similarly, imagine a clever thief, someone that's stealing your stuff. Well, the fact that they have more knowledge that they are actually clever seems to corrupt the value of the knowledge that they have, right? They're using the knowledge in a way that they shouldn't. And so this thing that is valuable has been corrupted in some way because the person is misusing it. Similarly, courage, right? Imagine, if you were wartime in World War II, would you rather be facing a cowardly Nazi or a courageous Nazi? Right? It seems that the courage here has been corrupted insofar as it's being used in the wrong kind of way. The courageous Nazi seems somehow worse than the cowardly Nazi. So these kinds of things seem corruptible, these kinds of things that we can that are definitely of value and even of moral value. But insofar as they're things that are worthy of pursuit, we need to sort of pursue them in the right way, Kant thinks. And we need to, in order to do that, we have to sort of recognize what thing is ultimately incorruptible and of most value as it's incorruptible. And we need to pursue that thing in a sense in order to, be moral. And what exactly is that? Well, according to Kant, the only thing that is ultimately incorruptible, he thinks, the thing that is worthy of valuing and pursuing at all times, is the having of a good will. You need to have a good will. What in the world is a good will? Well, what first is a will? And then we can think about what a good one is. Well, a will, we often talk about, we often say things like, oh yeah, people have free will. They have the free will to choose what it is that they want to do. But what exactly does it mean to have a will? What exactly does a will do? Well, the will, especially in this Kantian way of thinking about it, is your human autonomy, where human autonomy is understood as the ability to choose to set goals or ends for yourself, and the ability to recognize the necessary means to those ends, the actions that one has to take in order to achieve those ends, and the ability to motivate ourselves in order to take those means, right? For the most part, only humans have autonomy. Maybe, aliens and maybe some higher level animals have autonomy. But for the most part, only humans have autonomy because only humans have the rational capacity to actually think about what it is that they're doing and choose actions that they want to take, because they see that those actions are things that they need to take in order to achieve their goals. Many animals, are not able to motivate themselves on the basis of decisions that they make, right, to pursue particular things. Most animals are driven by what we might think of as merely their desires and their instincts. Now, of course, humans are driven by desires and instincts as well, but on top of that, Kant thinks we are driven and able to act on the basis of our wills. We are able to set goals for ourselves and then act to achieve those goals. And he thinks that that makes us particularly interesting, and that makes us particularly, moral. You don't, blame a lion for eating a gazelle, even if that counts as a kind of animal murder or something like that, right? It's not like a moral injustice in this case. Whereas, you do blame people for doing things that are problematic, even if they're, driven by a desire to do something, right? So what then is a good will? Well, a good will is basically a will that is able to set and choose the right goals and the right ends, the ones that are actually good, right, for oneself, right? And that involves the ability to recognize what's actually good and what's actually worthy of pursuit. What kinds of things really are good for yourself and for others, and what kinds of things really, what kinds of things you really should be pursuing. And then gives you also the ability to sort of know and take the means to achieving those goals, the actions that you have to take in order to achieve those good goals. And then finally, the ability to motivate oneself, to actually do the things, to get up off your butt and do the things that are the good things to do in order to achieve the good ends that you have, right? So you got to set good goals, right? They've got to really be good for you. You've got to be able to recognize that they're good and worthy of pursuit. You've got to try and know how to achieve those goals, know how to take the necessary means to achieving those goals, and then motivate yourself to actually take those actions in an attempt to achieve those goals. So in a sense, at the end, good intentions are what morality is all about on Kant's view. Your intentions, like the ability for you to intend to do the right thing at the right time in the right way, while recognizing that it's the right thing to do, that's like the entirety of morality on Kant's view. So Kant thinks that ultimately, actions that come from a goodwill or are based on a goodwill are really the only actions that are actually morally worthy or worthy of moral praise. So he thinks, in a sense, like an action can have any sort of consequences whatsoever, but only actions that come from a goodwill are actually worthy of moral praise. What exactly are those? What is it for an action to come from a goodwill? Well, according to Kant, he says a bunch of complicated, confusing things, but one of them that's interesting is, well, he says that actions that come from a goodwill are actions that are done from respect for duty or the moral law. That is, actions that recognize what is good to do and what people have obligations to do. Any action in which you are sort of recognize that it's something that you should do, morally speaking, then if you do that action on the basis of recognizing that it's the morally right thing to do, that's acting in a way that is morally worthy of acting. So basically, you should take actions because you recognize that they are the right thing to do. And if you do that, then Kant thinks good on you. It doesn't matter if, the action in the end doesn't really succeed or the consequences don't really end up being the best. As long as you know that you were trying to do the right thing, and that's why you took the action that you did, then your action is morally worthy. He gives a kind of example here. So you can imagine like a merchant, and this merchant is selling you something that, you know, you don't really know a whole lot about. You're not in the market for this kind of thing. You just happen to have to buy one right this minute. And you know, you're in a situation where you could easily be taken advantage of, and it's sort of obvious to the merchant that you could be taken advantage of. Well, it seems like there's four different things that the merchant could do to you, right? The first would be that he could obviously just cheat you and charge you an unfair price. Now, this would be clearly the wrong thing to do. He would be doing something morally problematic insofar as he's cheating you. But then there are three other kinds of actions that seem in line with doing what's right, but only one of them, Kant thinks, is actually morally worthy of praise. So the other three options are this. First, he could charge you a fair price out of kind of prudence, out of prudential reasoning. He could be thinking like, well, look, if I don't charge this guy the right price, then he might end up telling his friends, and then his friends aren't going to come to me in order to, you know, buy this thing, say it's like a car or something, because they know that I, you know, might cheat them. Well, okay, so in that case, he's thinking, I'll give him a fair price because I don't want my business to dry up. Well, that's to do the right thing, but in a sense, it seems like it's not to do it for the right reason on Kant's view. A second option is that, you know, suppose that the merchant is just a happy-go-lucky guy, and on the basis of the fact that he's having such a good day, he decides to give you a fair price. You know, things are going well for him, business is booming. So, you know, he's happy and he gives you a fair price. Well, this too is, you know, to act in accordance with what's right to do. And you know, it seems like the action is, in a sense, a good one, but acting simply out of this kind of proclivity for being happy doesn't seem, at least on Kant's view, the kind of way, a way to do the right thing for the right reason. And so Kant again thinks that this is acting in the right way, but not acting in a moral way. Finally, there's the case that Kant thinks really is worthy of moral praise and is acting morally in a morally good way, and that's the case in which the merchant charges you a fair price because he recognizes that it's the right thing to do. He recognizes that this is the right way to treat you. The right thing to do is to give you a fair price, and insofar as he recognizes that he should give you a fair price because it's the right thing to do, then he's done the right thing for the right reason. And so if unless, you know, so this merchant, you know, he could be down in the dumps, right? Suppose he's not very happy, he's having a hard day, but he still treats you fairly because he gives you a fair price, understanding that it's the right thing to do. Like, it doesn't matter his state of mind. That's the idea. It also doesn't matter, you know, if suppose he could be happy, he could also be acting out of prudence, as long as what he's doing ultimately is doing the right thing because he recognizes that it's the right thing to do. Then he's acting morally correctly and in a morally worthy way, a way that is worthy of moral praise on Kant's view. Kant thought that there was really just one main moral law that we all have to follow. And he gave this law the name of the categorical imperative. He took this law and gave multiple formulations of it in an attempt to try and make it clear what exactly this law says and how to follow it, to kind of give us an attempt at a decision procedure like we had with utilitarianism, right? For utilitarianism, we just had do the thing that maximizes utility, right? For everyone, try to make everyone as most happy as possible. For Kant, we have these kind of complicated but interesting attempts at giving us a law to follow, a principle that can guide us. So here's two formulations of what Kant thinks of as the same law, basically, but they're both kind of complicated. And I'll just really explain the second one, but the first one is interesting to sort of think about. So the first one is called the formula of universality. And the formula basically goes like this. Kant thinks the moral law tells us that we should act on maxims, basically rules of action. We should act on rules of action that you can at the same time will to be universal rules that everyone has to follow kind of all the time. Basically, what Kant means here is something like, really what you should be doing is that you should be acting in ways that you think everyone, in a sense, could or should act on, right? If everyone can act in that way and should act in that way, then that's the kind of rule that you should really be following. The sort of more intuitive understanding or principle that Kant gives is called the formula of humanity, where the formula of humanity says, act so as to treat humanity and yourself and others always as an end in itself and never as a mere means. Basically here, what Kant is saying is that you should respect the value of valuable things, particularly humans or creatures that have rational autonomy. He thinks that whenever you see that a creature has rational autonomy, the ability to set ends and pursue their own ends, and a will, in a sense, anytime you see that someone has a will and is able to act in these ways by choosing what to do and then pursuing what to do, you should be treating them as valuable, as creatures that have the ability to set their own ends and pursue them, and not as a mere means, where that means that you shouldn't be treating them in such a way as to subjugate their ends and goals completely to your own. And what exactly does this mean? How should we think about this? Well, the easiest case to apply this to is the case of slavery. Slavery is the epitome of a violation of the case of the formula of humanity. The formula of humanity, again, says, act in such a way that you treat humanity, wherever you see it, as an end in itself, never as a mere means. That means that whenever you see the fact that somebody is rational, that they have the ability to choose their goals, set their goals, decide for themselves what and where they want to be, who and where they want to be, like what they want to do with their lives, etc. You should always, sometimes you have to interact with these people, and sometimes you have to use them in order to get things done. You have to, if you're a boss, then you have people that work underneath you. You need them to do the things that they need to do in order for you to succeed as the boss. But you should never be treating these people as merely a means, as merely a stepping stone to your goals. You need to also take into account their goals. And this is why, your boss pays you, right? Your boss pays you. You have your own goals and you want to achieve them, and you need the means to achieving them. And one of those means is often money. And so you help somebody else, your boss, achieve their goals, and then your boss gives you money, in a sense, to achieve your own. Well, slavery is like the obvious case where this is corrupted. In a slave case, in a slavery case, we have individuals that have their own goals, are autonomous, have their own ability to think for themselves, choose their own goals, set their own goals, and try and pursue those goals. And yet the slave owner is treating them as a mere means to his goals, right? The slave owner, say, in the old South, has a plantation that needs farming, and he doesn't ultimately care what his slaves want, need, or how they desire to live, or anything like that. He just needs them to do the things that he needs them to do for his own sake. He doesn't take their autonomy into consideration. That's ultimately what it means to treat someone as a mere means. To treat someone as a mere means is to fail to respect the fact that those people actually have goals, plans, desires, and to just kind of treat them in a way that you're using them as a tool to your own ends, to get your own stuff. To treat someone as an end in themselves, which is what Kant says we need to do, we need to recognize other people as having these ends, these goals, these abilities for themselves. And then we need to, when we interact with them, not sort of cheat them out of those things. We need to help them achieve their goals as much as they help us achieve our goals, in a sense. Applying this to bioethics, there's a number of different applications that the Kantian way of thinking has to bioethical framework. So Kant thought that lying was sort of always morally impermissible, and to lie could be, and the reason here, or one reason for thinking that, is because he thought lying was to treat others' ends as somehow subjugated to your own, right? You know the truth, and you're trying to get someone else to do something or believe something that you yourself don't believe or know the opposite. And this, in a sense, is similar to failing to be as formative as possible. And so, in a medical scenario, it seems like doctors need to be as informative as possible with their patients, and so we have this notion of informed consent. Doctors need to tell their patients as much as they possibly can, so that the patient can make an informed decision about what it is to do. Even if this information will cause the patient some emotional harm, it seems that they deserve to know. In the past, there were cases in which doctors would not tell their patient certain things out of a fear or out of a sort of paternalistic tendency to try and make things better off for the patient. But that doesn't allow the patient to know sort of the things that they need to know to set their affairs in order, in the case of them possibly dying, or to try and take an alternative route than going through the misery of chemotherapy or a certain extreme form of surgery. Now, of course, there are problems with the Kantian view as well. There are a few that are kind of difficult to think about, right? So it seems obvious that respecting people is important, right? And expecting people's goals, their autonomy, their rights. But do we always have to respect everyone? So paternalism is this idea that if you're in authority in some sense over someone, you can restrict the freedom of that person in order to make them better off. And paternalism sometimes seems okay. Paternalism sometimes seems like you ought to act in certain ways to restrict certain people's abilities, when you know that by restricting their abilities in this way, they will have a better life situation. That seems, on the Kantian view, it's really hard to see how you can restrict someone's freedoms and tell them, no, you can't do what you want to do, what you plan to do, like literally violate their autonomy in a certain sense, while also for the sake of them, right? It seems problematic to think that you can somehow violate one of their basic rights to freedom to do what they wish to do, while just because you think, oh, this is going to be better off, make them better off in the end. Like who are you in a sense to decide who's better off? But then on the same time, if you are objectively actually going to make them better off, then it seems in a lot of cases justified to stop them from doing what it is that they want to do. Similarly, in a sort of more extreme case, this is my go-to is the nuclear bomb case. Imagine there's a nuclear bomb that's about to go off in Los Angeles. It's going to kill 1 million people. And the only way, this nuclear bomb has been implanted by a mischievous terrorist inside of a person. And the only way to disable this nuclear bomb is to kill this person. And this person is an innocent bystander. Well, in one sense, this person's going to die anyway when the nuclear bomb goes off. But in another sense, right, this seems one of those interestingly problematic cases where we have to violate someone's rights, some individual's rights, in order to save everyone. Well, what's going on here? It seems like this is one of those strange kinds of moral dilemma cases in which we have to do something bad in order to make something better happen for the greater good of everyone. Is this a morally justified situation? Well, it seems like from the Kantian point of view, no, you shouldn't kill this person. But from the utilitarian point of view, you have to kill this person, right, to save these many lives. Well, it's an interesting kind of quandary, and this seems like a problem for the Kantian point of view, at least from my perspective, insofar as I think, yeah, you need to save the million lives if you have the ability to save the million lives in this case. So sorry and so sad that the one person has to die. So thinking more about a particular kind of bioethics-y type cases, paternalism is something of a must, right? We have to act paternalistically sometimes. You, at the very least, right, it's when you're taking care of children. You can't simply allow children to do whatever they want to do, whatever they will, right? You have to restrict their freedoms for their own good. If you didn't, then they would never eat their vegetables. They would never put sunscreen on, right? They would run around naked and be dirty all the time. And some of these things aren't obviously terrible, but for the most part, the child would get sick, not be healthy, not have a good life. So especially early on, because you have to take care of children, you have to be paternalistic and do things, sometimes things that are against their will, in order to make them better off, right? Getting them dental work, getting them, like things that are, getting them their shots. No child wants a shot, but it's better that they're vaccinated than not. But it is interesting, as children age, it gets much less clear to what extent their autonomy must be respected, right? So legally in this country, we have this sort of age of 18, where legally somebody becomes an adult and so can then make their decisions for themselves. But what are you supposed to do kind of before that? It seems like, there are plenty of 15, 16, 17-year-olds out there that have, minds of their own and are able to make fully cognizant decisions, but they aren't 18 yet. Should you be as paternalistic towards them at certain ages, especially if you know what you're going to do to them, or what they need, what is better off only in the sense in which you think that it's better off for them, rather than not. I mean, even if it is objectively better off for them, if they don't want to do it, right? So this is like, children, somebody in high school that just wants to drop out. Objectively that it'll be better for them if they don't drop out of high school. But can you restrict their autonomy all the way through and tell them, no, you have to keep going. Similarly, what about the autonomy of people with certain kinds of disabilities, like people that are born with certain deficiencies that they are never going to recover or overcome. These kinds of people, they simply don't have the ability. They don't have full autonomy. They don't have full control over their mental capacities, right? They don't always have full ability to foresee future events, to plan for the future, to decide what they should do, what is really good to do, what is best for them. In these kinds of cases, paternalism seems justified. And then also in dementia and Alzheimer's patients, right? Individuals that are losing their rational autonomy, it seems that we need decision makers for them. We need people to step in to tell them what they need to do in order to best take care of themselves. So there's a kind of balancing act that we need to play with here. And much of the rest of the class is going to be worried with this very question. How is it that we act in order to take everyone's best interests into account, while at the same time respecting pretty much everyone's autonomy? We need to do both of these things. We need to respect people's autonomy, respect the fact that they have the ability to choose for themselves what they wish to do, while also restricting people's autonomy, sometimes in many cases, in order to bring about the best possible scenarios for the most possible people. And it's an interesting question whether or not a certain amount of paternalism can be balanced with the respect for persons and their autonomy. And then, the sort of way that we're going to go forward is thinking about when we should and ultimately shouldn't be paternalistic in certain kinds of cases, particularly in healthcare situations, right? So not next week, but the week after, we'll discuss, like, paternalism in thinking about, like, the current vaccine for the pandemic, right? Should we force people to get the vaccine? Do we need to force people to wear masks all the time and to take serious precautions? Like, should the police be showing up at people's houses to make sure that they're actually quarantining after they've been exposed to the virus or something along those lines? What kind of paternalistic measures are justified in order to, save other people's lives while, restricting the autonomy of particular individuals' ability, their ability to do what they will. Some case studies and sort of the final thing here, I think some ideas that you might have for thinking through these and writing up a discussion post in this case is, you could think about, you could describe and investigate sort of the idea of balancing the sort of personal interests or personal will that people have, and then general well-being considerations for people in various health situations or with various health issues. So, like, thinking about people with addiction that seem unable to control their addictive tendencies, is it okay to be paternalistic towards those people, right? Somebody that simply can't put down the bottle or can't go a day without a cigarette or shooting heroin. Similarly, people with extreme memory loss that can't remember who they are and what they're doing, or can't really see into the future. What kind of paternalism is justified for those people? What kind of decision making are we allowed to have in such a way that, what kind of decisions can we make for them without running afoul of their own personal autonomy to do what they want to do? Similarly, like, there are more interesting and extreme cases like congenital insensitivity to pain. These are people that simply don't have pain receptors in the same ways that you and I do, and they live in the world, but they have to be, kept a careful eye on in certain ways to make sure that they aren't injuring themselves in certain kinds of cases. It seems that this would play a very interesting role in their lives, and we should, or somebody in their life might take a very paternalistic stance towards trying to do what is best for them while restricting their freedoms, not allowing them to play certain sports or do certain activities where they might seriously damage themselves without knowing it. And then also, so there's this, like, there are interesting and classic cases like children with parents that have particular religious beliefs, right? So in many states, if a child up until the age of 17 disagrees with their parent, like, so suppose you have someone who thinks, you have a parent that thinks vaccines are problematic, but the child thinks that they want the vaccine, 17-year-old, right? Well, up to who's it up to get the vaccine, the child or the parent? Or similarly, I think in Oregon or Washington, there are some laws that say, like, if the parent is of a certain religious bent and thinks that certain medical procedures are problematic, like blood transfusions, say, but a blood transfusion seems necessary in order to save the child's life, then the state, in a sense, steps in to administer sort of a right of custody. They take over and say, no, we're going to save this child until the child is 18 and can decide for itself, right? So an interesting case, right? Like, even if the child, take a 17-year-old that's has this religious view that it's wrong to have blood transfusions, but because they're of this age, the state can step in over the authority of the parents, even in order to administer a blood transfusion, in order to save the life of the child until the child turns 18. These are interesting and difficult cases that are worth thinking about, and so I highly recommend looking up some for yourself or thinking about them and writing about them in your discussion post for this week. All right, that's the end for today. Have a good week.